lot of board games tend to be designed by a single person, people like Donald X. Vaccarino or Uwe Rosenberg. Games like Dominion or Agricola can pretty fairly be attributed to their single designer, barring playtesters and whatnot. But Disney Villainous was not. It was designed by Prospero Hall, a small game design company. Villainous was literally designed by committee. This turn of phrase is often used derisively, implying a product that is directionless, or perhaps tugged in too many directions, something built entirely of compromises that has long since lost its true purpose, if it had one to begin with. And yet, Disney Villainous doesn't feel that way. It's one of those rare stories of collaboration done right, where outcome triumphed over ego and we got a product that was polished and high quality. And even better, Prospero Hall seemed to learn over time how to make better and better villains, to the point where I could still argue that Perfectly Wretched is the pinnacle of villainous design. Now this may come as a shock to some of you. Aren't these three the weakest out of all the villains? Well, yes and no. Their perceived weakness, I think, stems from one main pillar of high-level villainous play: discarding. If you looked at the thousands of competitive games played over Tabletop Simulator and you looked at how far through their decks each player got, I think you'll find that the vast majority of the time, the winner is the one who discarded more cards. Now you'll get flukes like Dr. Facilier getting Talisman and Real New Orleans in his opening hand, but on average, I think this holds. The issue with the Perfectly Wretched villains is that in previous boxes, each villain had fairly obvious cards to discard, what I'd like to call chaff, so that it's a pretty easy decision to make. I need to get a Magic Lamp and a Hypnotize, and these cards don't get me there, so in the discard pile they go. But for the Perfectly Wretched villains, the decks have gotten so polished that really every single card has use. Revenge and Misdirection can be fantastic, but I don't need them right now, but maybe next turn, I'll hold on to them. And that's why Mother Gothel loses, because her pilot is just holding on to the same three cards turn after turn, and she never finds the important cards: Hairbrush, Crown, the Stabbingtons. Even with a higher average card quality, you still need to be discarding regularly as these characters. The other thing is that the Perfectly Wretched villains in particular rely on getting their opponent into a fate lock, because being start of turn villains, it's often fairly easy to nudge them out of their win condition. Up through this set, locking out your opponent from fating you when you reach your objective was a key part of competitive play. Of those first 15 villains, only one of them can consistently avoid a fate lock, and that's Prince John with Sir Hiss at Nottingham. However, if Prince John is going to Nottingham and all he's doing is fating, he's really just wasting time. And that's another thing. For all these villains, their locations are set up so you have to make a choice. Do you fate, or do you progress your own win con? That's why the gain 3 power spots have 2 play a card actions, and the fate locations have 1 or even no power to gain. You need to choose between hindering your opponent and actually trying to win yourself. The exception here is post-map Captain Hook, who can make significant progress at Hangman's Tree, as well as pretty easily get out from under a fate lock, which is part of why he feels so broken to me as a character. Ursula feels like less of an issue, because if she changes form to unlock the palace, then sure, she can fate indefinitely, but going to the palace feels like a waste because there's neither a discard nor a play action there. All she can do is gain power, fate, and maybe move something. And again, we come to that same issue. The player who wins is the one who gets through their deck the fastest. And that's why the Perfectly Wretched villains feel so well made to me. There are no surprise gotcha wins out of nowhere. Every card in each deck has a use at some point. They all have multiple tools for dealing with heroes, and the Fate decks themselves are honestly not all that punishing. There are no Ariels or Herculeses here that bring progress to a grinding halt. Even Mickey Mouse isn't all that bad. You can still progress to your start of turn goals, and when everything is in place, you can airstrike the little rat. However, they are all on the slower side of villains, which comes with dropping those surprise wins, which makes getting in a fate lock all the more important, because if they get hit by fate, turn after turn after turn, they start to crumple, which makes it seem to me like fating turn after turn after turn was never intended to be a valid strategy you'd be able to make. Again, this is why fate locations have so little power to gain. But Prospero Hall no longer designs Villainous. This may be news to you or might not be, but they were bought by Funko and severed ties with Ravensburger. There is now a new in-house team at Ravensburger that develops the Villainous line, which now has multiple iterations. Everything from the first MarVil Villainous set onwards have been designed without the input of the original creators. Now, keeping to just the Disney sets, I feel the successors at Ravensburger have done a decent job. There were some hiccups with the wordings on cards and despicable plots, but I think in terms of gameplay the set was very well made, perhaps my second favorite after Perfectly Wretched. Bigger and Badder is a little shakier because it flagrantly violates the idea of needing to choose between progress and fate, but it's still not too bad. Madame Mim tears right through the Perfectly Wretched villains whose slowness means they stand essentially zero chance against her fate onslaught, but there are a few villains who can stand up to her. I've personally had some decent success using Lotso against her, which makes sense as they're part of the same set. But I want to talk about the new lines, MarVil and Star Wars Villainous, where the two Ravensburger Disney sets have been experimental with realm design and tiles and things like that. MarVil and Star Wars have added whole new mechanics that make them fundamentally incompatible with each other and with Disney. Now, I'm not some Luddite who's afraid of change. I think innovation is better than stagnation, and in long-standing franchises, you need to shake things up or people will get bored. We don't want Villainous to just be 100 Maleficents and Captain's Hook. But changes, particularly large ones, should be made purposefully and with thought as to why the original decisions were made in the first place and what the consequences are of changing them. For Disney, allowing the bigger and badder characters to fate and make progress has had the consequence of shutting the slower villains that rely on fate locks out of competitive play, which is a major reason why the Let's Get Wicked server has started implementing a pick ban system. But for MarVil and Star Wars, the changes made don't just mean it's harder for certain characters to win. The changes, at least for me, make the game less fun. Let me explain. For MarVil Villainous, a few changes have been made, most of them pretty minor, like changing move to relocate or requiring an ally to be at a location for a vanquish even if the hero is at 0 strength. These are pretty trivial and not an issue, except for needing to remember that there is a difference if you're coming from Disney. The big change made for MarVil is the shared fate deck. Now, I understand why they did it. It makes sense for MarVil villains to share heroes because, well, that's what they do in the comics. However, as a gameplay choice, it makes the game worse. For Disney, fate decks are tailor-made for their villain, allowing them to refer to unique mechanics as well as to do things that are minor setbacks to this particular villain that would utterly destroy another. Jacques can hurt Lady Tremaine, but she has defensive tools in Lucifer and vicious practical jokes to work around him, and as a last resort can I said if to get whatever was discarded back. Jacques thrown at Dr. Facilier being able to discard the talisman would be a nightmare scenario for the Shadow Man. Likewise, the gospel truth hitting Kronk on the run, reshuffling Peter Pan back into the Fate deck, or Aladdin stealing the Robot Queen. Actually, that last one is more funny than anything, but still. Because of this, for the most part, the MarVil Fate decks, even the villain-specific ones, not the common shared ones, are much more generic. The game is much more reliant purely on location covering with piles of strength, rather than surgically undoing your unique evil plot. This makes fating more boring and honestly more pointless, because you also go through the fate deck less often because it's so much bigger, and because the rules tell you to only reveal one fate card at a time, but that's stupid and you should ignore that. Just reveal two like in Disney. Because fating is made so much more generic, it's much less likely that any fate card you draw will actually stop an opponent or push them back from their win con. It's as if Mother Gothel's entire fate deck were just copies of Maximus and maybe a single floating lights. Now, when a more villain-specific hero does sneak through the cracks, it can unleash havoc. Take Kate Bishop, a hero in Madame Mask's fate deck who prevents the villain whose domain she's in from playing effects. This is fine for Madame Mask, who has plenty of allies to vanquish with, but if she's played into MODOK's domain, it shuts down most of how that villain works around heroes. This is exacerbated by the fact that MODOK's only vanquish action is top row, meaning that if Kate Bishop is played to cover that, MODOK is prevented from defeating heroes for the rest of the game. What's been frustrating is when I've pointed this out to certain individuals as a problem, the response I've gotten back is, well, Madame Mask will want to defeat Kate Bishop eventually to get the vendetta. And In no universe is Madame Mask going to do that unless it's the play that wins her the game. If you have two buttons, one of which is slightly progress your win con, and the other one is your opponent can no longer undo fates you send at them, you bet your ass you are slamming that second one with your entire body. And in the same box as these two is Loki, who, look at this domain. Does something seem off to you? Wait a minute. Wait a goddamn minute. Why does he have both his discard actions top row? Why? It is fully possible for Loki to be completely locked out of the game, as in, can no longer do anything, let alone win, if his two discards are covered. He gets Odin Allfather played on him, and everything in his hand is effects that deal with mischief. He can't play anything, he can't discard, he's just stuck. The only thing he can do is see how much of his opponent's time he can waste before his inevitable defeat. I know this is possible because this happened to me in the very first game I played as Loki. This is a problem. When you make changes to a system, you need to do so purposefully. Before you make a change, you need to consider, why is this system the way it is? Why does each villain have two fate actions, one top row, one bottom row, and ditto for discard actions? Why do all of them, save one, have a gain 3 power play 2 cards location? Why is Prince John different? And looking at how MarVil Villainous has been handled, it kind of seems like some of these changes were made just willy-nilly. I'm not saying that the designers at Ravensburger are idiots or that they don't know what they're doing. If anything, I'm lamenting that it seems pretty clear that Prospero Hall didn't send over any kind of design bible that might have prevented these kinds of mistakes. And so they're making changes to the game without fully understanding why they were the way they were in the first place. And then there are events. Whoo boy, are these awful. Most of them have a passive ability that slows the game down because it hinders everyone, and the only way to get rid of it is to throw allies at it. But most of them require a fair amount of strength worth of allies to do away with, so it becomes a prisoner's dilemma. You could sacrifice your own allies to get rid of the event, or you could do nothing and wait for another player to do it for you. Sure, you don't get the rewards from getting rid of it, but most of the rewards aren't really that big a deal anyway, and if they are, you get them whether you contributed every bit of strength required or if you sent over a single 0 strength ally. So there's no motivation to actually get rid of it, so it just sits there, making the game take longer. The villain-specific events are slightly better as you have more motivation to deal with them, but still an issue. It doesn't help that many MarVil villains heavily rely on their allies for their objectives. Hela, Thanos, Madame Mask, and Taskmaster explicitly need them. Compared to Disney, where allies for the most part are simply how you get rid of heroes. So we have a situation where you can either keep pushing toward your win with this inconvenience hanging over you, or you can deal with the inconvenience which at the same time helps your opponents. Do you see how this is a problem? More recently, remarks were made about how MarVil is more competitive than Disney, and I find this a laughable take. I think what they were trying to say is that MarVil has more interaction, particularly as it seems to be intended for play with 3 or more people, but competitive? I have seen nail-biting games of Disney Villainous between 2 players who knew their villains inside and out, and it can be a blast just watching it, let alone playing it, but I have never had that experience with MarVil. The generified nature of the shared fate deck means it falls so much more to luck of the draw who wins, and the more players you add to a game, the less likely it is that the most skilled person will take the victory. So, no, MarVil Villainous is not more competitive than Disney, and it never will be. Now, I will give Ravensburger credit. The changes made in the Disney line in Despicable Plots seem deliberate and purposeful. Horned King and Lady Tremaine have very unique realms, and I can understand the logic behind their action placement. Horned King's gain 3 power is a top row action because of how easy it is for him to keep his board clear once he has Cauldronborn out, and because power starving him is the chief way to keep him from getting those Cauldronborn out in the first place, and because he has a vanquish action at that location, and because he has a bottom row fate, gain 2 power next door, and so forth. But when I look at the MarVil domains, I just find myself going, why is this laid out like this? It almost seems like the domains were built by an AI or something, or they tossed out the actions like a seer with their divining rods and let the actions lay where they were scattered. The motivation at best seems to be because we can, rather than this is what works best for this villain. Then we come to Star Wars Villainous. At first, I thought this would be an improvement over MarVil, as they were returning to the personal fate decks as well as bringing back conditions. But having now played it, two things bring it down for me. First is the split of resources. Now you have credits and ambition. This just seems to add complication purely for the sake of flavor. I now have to keep track of two different currencies as well as remember to gain ambition every turn. I'm guessing the intent was to add more strategic decision making, deciding whether to go somewhere you can play a credits costing card or somewhere you can play an ambition costing card, but in practice it just frustrates me. This is exacerbated by the fact that the ambition action also serves as a pseudo activate action, which in the case of Kylo Ren has the very silly outcome of once Supreme Leader Snoke is in play, you will never play an ambition costing action for the rest of the game because none of them are better than simply using Snoke's ambition action. Compared to Gaston, you can both activate Monsieur Dark and play Come Into the Light on the same turn. Monsieur Snoke, not so much. It just makes his gameplay very, very dull. This is a change that should not have been made. Star Wars Villainous should have stuck to just power. And then we come to vehicles. On the one hand, I think having cards you can play as new locations to visit in your sector is pretty neat, but the fate vehicles make the game intolerable. Firstly, the main way to get rid of them is with your own vehicles. You know, these cool new locations with actions you'd love to use. Just waste the whole thing in a vanquish action to get rid of this vehicle. And why would you do that? None of the vehicles have passive static effects, just doing things when they're played, right? Well, if you read the rulebook, each fate vehicle in your sector decreases your hand size by 1. Digest that little factoid for a moment. Now, remembering that the Fate deck has only 15 cards in it and your Villain deck has 30, statistically you are much more likely to get a Fate vehicle thrown at you than you are to draw a Villain vehicle. Now imagine how much harder that becomes when you have a Fate vehicle on you already and now you have a hand size of 3. With both players buried under 2 Fate vehicles that they have no way to remove, the game becomes an intolerable slog. Until you can draw into a Villain vehicle, you must suffer with a hand size of 2. And when you do draw one, you either have to vanquish the Fate vehicle, meaning it can come back around again, and you just wasted your Villain vehicle, or simply engage it, meaning the Fate vehicle is still there, covering the actions of your Villain vehicle, but hey, at least you get to draw back up to 3 again. Villain vehicles are a cool idea that I would have loved to see fully realized. Fate vehicles were a mistake, or at the very least, should have been play-tested more. I don't like being so negative. Disney Villainous is a fantastic game, possibly my favorite. It really saddens me that these other 2 iterations fail as they do, and I don't really think they can be salvaged either. New characters aren't going to fix the underlying problems with these 2 systems. But Weiro, I hear you cry through my computer screen, why not just shut your howling screamer and let people enjoy things if they want to? If you don't like it, don't play it. I exercise my howling screamer because if you don't criticize, then things don't get fixed. If something happens that you don't like, say so. Give feedback, even negative feedback. Now, by that same token, give positive feedback if you like something. I enjoyed Despicable Plots quite a bit and would love to see more of that kind of gameplay design, minus the wording weirdness. It doesn't seem like Ravensburger is going to let up on product shipment anytime soon, as this seems to be their cash cow, at least until Lorcana drops. I just hope that they really put in real play testing into these games. I get that these are marketed at casual family gamers who maybe just like how the movers look, but the original Disney Villainous was such a refreshing surprise of a game with deep gameplay and strong replay value, and I think it would be a good thing for Villainous sets to be playtested by players with a competitive mindset who will spot soft locks and realm weirdness and provide feedback to correct that sort of thing before product is finalized and shipped. And if your comeback to that is, well, who's gonna care about competitive if it's just casual gamers? Making it better for competitive gamers doesn't make it worse for casual gamers, okay? Designing for competitive play can make it better for both. And for all the money this franchise has made for Ravensburger, is that really too much to ask?